the civilization that built itself around opium was the late Minoan civilization. I mean, when they first did the translation, when Michael Ventris first translated Linear B, the tallies that they were translating, they thought this symbol was for wheat because the tallies were so huge. Then they realized there were tallies for gum opium. It's a complicated question because the products of opium are fairly unsavory and virulent, although they do have their defenders. My analysis of opium and the way I've used it in my life was to escape pain of one sort or another. The opium reverie is not as interesting as the hashish reverie because it's harder to retain. The way I look at late Minoan civilization is it was in great mourning for the passing of the goddess, because Minoan Crete was the last bastion of the old goddess religion that had come out of Africa at the time of Çatalhöyük, but it all died in Asia Minor in the 5th millennium. But it survived in Minoan Crete up until 1000 BC. So for 3 millennia, Minoan civilization drifted in an ahistorical dream, and slowly over time the accentuation of opium use increased. It's interesting, opium, you say this and people's eyes widen. Isn't this a drug of degradation and addiction? Opium has been around for thousands and thousands of years. It wasn't until 1624 that the English physician John Playfair noticed for the first time, so far as we can tell, that it was an addictive substance. Before 1624, no one knew opium was addicting. There is one mention in Dioscorides, but other than that. So the virulence of opium addiction is tremendously overrated. In fact, it's silly to talk about it that way, unless you're using it as an instrument of national policy. It's funny, we have drug wars. 100 years ago, a little more than 100 years ago, they had a drug war in the Far East. It was called the Opium War. What was the Opium War about? The British government's wish to sell opium in the ports of China against the objections of the Chinese emperor. The Chinese emperor didn't want opium in China, and the British, whose tea trade had undergone a collapse, had shifted their agricultural production to opium, and they were unloading it on the Chinese population while they tried to figure out what to do with all these tea ships. So in 100 years, we've gone from a war to force people to buy opium to, the present state of manic, schizophrenic attitudes about it. Yeah. This is very possible. Pain is a very subjective thing, and I imagine much of antiquity was fairly unpleasant, and opium would be there, and it would certainly be there if you developed tumors, untreatable ulcers, any painful chronic condition. Opium would be your obvious recourse. Addiction as a general concept, it's probably in John Playfair. They began purifying and using alcohol extractions. Opium is, it's interesting how these intoxicants, both opium and alcohol were made popular by alchemists who thought they had discovered the elixir of life. When Raymondus Lully discovered distilled alcohol, he got so jacked up behind it that he announced the end of the world. He said, hey, this stuff is so good. And opium was popularized by Paracelsus. In fact, Paracelsus invented chemical medicine. If you want to look for a kind of a bad guy, or at least a black hat figure, it was Paracelsus who said we shouldn't use herbs, we should use purified extractions, we should make pills, we should get rid of all this midwifery and all this nonsense and put medicine on a scientific basis. Of course, he was also a mad alchemist and popularized opium. In fact, von Helmont, a student of his, was so into popularizing opium that he signed his alchemical treatises Dr. Opiatus. Well, it's 11:30. Last shot.
With ayahuasca, can someone take that alone, or is it best to have sort of a guide?
Well, this issue of the guide, it's a good place to end. It depends on the kind of personality you are. I mean, I have always taken things alone because other people are such complicated creatures, and I can't ever relax completely in the presence of another person. And so they kind of hold me on the surface. But there certainly have been trips when I would have loved to have somebody to hug. If it doesn't bother you to be around people, or you don't feel that as a kind of impediment, then there should be a sitter. And always starting out or in uncertain situations, there should be a sitter, but the sitter should be very non-invasive. And my style of psychedelic tripping is calm, dark, comfortable, because I want to see what it is in a situation of sensory deprivation, which is where it's most beautiful. The best music is in silence, the best pictures is in darkness. Always I go in. Yeah, it's possible to take psychedelics and entirely miss the point because you are so extroverted and so nervous and agitated. I mean, Roland Fisher, who did all this experimental work with psilocybin, gave it to 25,000 people, published all these important papers, and he and I were talking one day, and I said, well, but Roland, aside from all this data and all this stuff, what do you make of the hallucinations? Just the source of them, the complexity of them? He said, I never closed my eyes. I never closed my eyes. I mean, is this denial or what? I could hardly believe my ears, I mean, the psychedelic experience is not... It shouldn't be projected. You don't take it and then look for a good movie or go out to catch AC/DC, or it's just silent darkness, and let this stuff come out of the organism and you will be amazed. I mean, this is your birthright, your real inner riches, and it's more than you expect, more than you imagine, more than you suppose, more than you can suppose. I mean, it's the center axis of what it is to be a minded, reflecting human being. I mean, we can go through life without knowing this, but is the game to go through life without knowing about as much as possible? That sounds like a fairly ass-backward approach to things. I think, we want to assimilate life. We want to explore it. We want to find the path to the next level. I mean, I can't believe that. I sort of believe the Catholic idea that there's an obligation to do something and to behave correctly, but it has nothing to do with attending Mass on Sunday and keeping your language clean. It has to do, I think, with an act of intellectual heroism of some sort. A way of positioning yourself vis-a-vis the experience of the world that then can lift you to higher and higher levels. And that's what these things were put here for. And if we use them, I still have hope. If we don't use them, then the momentum of the past will carry us into catastrophe. So, the choice is entirely ours and the societies that we live in, that we have a responsibility to reform. Well, that's it, folks. Thank you very much.